this is Dr. Supreet from Department of Commerce, University of Delhi. Today we'll be talking about the Incoterms, the very language of international trade, wherein all the transactions, all the settlements, terms and conditions are mentioned by these Incoterms. So whenever we are dealing in trade and that too in international trade, these are the most commonly used terminologies that are used in a contract of sale. So whenever a transaction is conducted between a buyer and seller and that too an international transaction, so therein these Incoterms are much common. So when we say that Incoterms, so this is the short form of the terminology called international commercial terms. So when we say international commercial terms of trade, so these international commercial terms of trade has been given by International Chamber of Commerce. So International Chamber of Commerce is one such global standard body which provides the rules and regulations with respect to the international transactions. There is a recent version of these Incoterms that is being released by the ICC in 2020. So what is the purpose of having these Incoterms and that being released by ICC is that it provides you a common language of trade wherein all the risks, responsibilities, liabilities, they are already fixed upon. They need not to, either the buyer or the seller need not to correspond to some additional terms or to just add upon the same, because they provide a set list of obligations on both buyer and the seller. So if both of them mention out these terms of trade in the contract, then it lists out certain obligations on the part of buyer and on the part of seller. Now, we have commonly used 11 Incoterms that are being used in international trade. So, one by one we are going to look into all these terminologies, because this in a manner is going to fixate the responsibilities of both the buyer and the seller, and it is going to represent that what are the obligations that lies onto the shoulder of your seller and what are the responsibilities or what are the costs that is to be borne by the buyer. Now for the same, if we just go into the very basic structuring of the international trade transaction, so what happens out in that transaction is that we move from having a transaction wherein the exporter does what? He entails all those activities of packaging the product, then loading them onto the vehicle or the common carrier for further transportation to the destination, that is the port or the place, and then further that paying of all the taxes, duties, those terminal charges, and then making sure that the goods are loaded onto the main vessel, and then thereon a contract of carriage is undertaken for further shipment to the place of the buyer, and then making sure that the insurance is being taken up and due destination charges, destination terminal charges, and then unloading out there, and then various other import duties are being undertaken in this entire course of activities, wherein it is being to be considered that the seller is going to perform all these layers of activities in order to run a transaction, in order to make sure that the goods reaches out to the ultimate buyer. Now when I list down all these activities, right from export packaging to unloading the same to paying these import duties, there are certain obligations that fall onto the shoulder of either the seller or the buyer. So that means they have to be very specific, that whether the seller is responsible for those costs or those obligations or the onus lies on to the buyers, right. So as I said that there are 11 Incoterms that specify the obligations of both the buyer and the seller with respect to different layers of activities. So the very first terminology is X works, which we call XW. Now X works is what? This is a terminology which is onto the extreme end, wherein the minimum liability that can be possible on a seller is levied, and the entire obligation, entire burden the cost, the risk factor, it lies onto the shoulder of the buyer. So herein we say that the very first process of, or the first activity in the course of this international transaction, which is your packaging. So that packaging activity, that very obligation lies onto the shoulder of the seller. Apart from that, every other activity listed out in this course of running an international transaction, it lies onto the shoulder of the buyer. So apart from that, everything, if we talk about in this sequence of activities, it falls onto the shoulder of the buyer. So when I say that the Incoterms state that XW is mentioned in that contract of sale between the buyer and the seller. So in that case, the seller will transfer the entire risk to the buyer starting the stage of your loading. So herein the first very terminology wherein we say about that X works. So in X works, if we list down the layer of activities starting from export packaging, so export packaging lies the risk, the cost of the same, of the packaging of the article, it lies on the shoulder of your seller. And then thereon, if there are loading charges of loading the product on the carrier, it lies onto the shoulder of the buyer. And further, if we talk about making sure the delivery of the articles to the port, that also lies, the cost and the risk both, it lies onto the shoulder of the buyer. Similarly, any terminal charges, any your carrier charges, any loading charges, any insurance, or your destination charges, or your any sort of unloading charges, import duties, everything passes on to the buyer. The buyer is supposed to make the payment of all further layer of activities. Payment in a sense is that now he is responsible to undertake or to engage those third party to take the to execute these activities right from loading to unloading to the port of destination. So herein there is the minimal role of your seller. He is just interested to do one thing, that is the packaging of the product. Apart from that, he nowhere is held responsible, or he nowhere is obligated to perform all those activities. So when we talk about those general obligations that lies onto the part of seller, is that the seller, it doesn't mean that that all those obligations, if it has to pass on to the buyer, the seller will do nothing and the seller will not perform any obligation with respect to provision of providing the you could say documentation. The documentation indeed is still a parameter wherein the seller has to cooperate. That means the exporter's formalities, all those export formalities has to be completed by the seller. The import formalities is there on the shoulder of your buyer, but the export formalities, they are onto the shoulder of your exporter, that is the seller, and he will make sure that utmost cooperation is provided to the buyer. Even though the loading activity, delivery activity, terminal charges, custom duty, all these fall onto the shoulder of your buyer, but still the seller would ensure utmost cooperation in providing those documentation. Number two, the seller has to make sure that the goods are provided at the agreed price, at the agreed destination. That destination has also to be mentioned out. So agreed destination, agreed price and agreed quantum on the date mentioned. So that is also to be taken care by the seller, that he performs those general obligations. Now in this case, since place activities are to be taken by the buyer, but in course of running those activities, in case any help, any cooperation, any document is required from the part of the seller, so the seller is supposed to provide those documents to the buyer. So that is what it is, that he has to cooperate, because certain documents, for example your commercial invoices, those packing lists, those invoices, generic invoices, they are to be provided by whom? They are to be provided by your seller, right? So that means those documentations has to be provided and it has to be cooperated with the buyer. Second point is that with respect to this very Incoterm is that herein this very Incoterm is not very generic to any specific mode of transportation. Rather, this very terminology can be used for any mode of transportation. Per se, you use a rail, you use a road transportation, airline, seaways. So you use any of these transportation mode, and in those in any of these transportation mode you can use these this very Incoterm, which is the one wherein there is the least responsibility or the risk or the obligation on the part of the seller. The buyer is the only one person, he is the one who has to take care of all the costs, all the obligations. So that ways it goes very lighter on the seller, right, and it goes a little heavier on to the buyer part because he has to undertake all those activities. Now another parameter with respect to the same when I say about X work is that insurance, which we always mention is a negotiable one, because the seller at times agree to provide the limited insurance of the consignment. So as per the clause, so those clause, according to those clauses, the seller will do that, it will provide the basic minimum cover, right. If buyer is interested to get the higher cover or the higher coverage of the consignment, so in that case the buyer has to bear the additional charges. So that is why it is said that insurance is one such segment in this entire transaction of trade wherein there is nothing specific that it lies onto the shoulder of the seller or the buyer. It is basically negotiable. So whatever being decided on a prior basis between your buyer and seller, so accordingly it has to be adjusted, accordingly the provisions for the same is to be taken care. Moreover, there are certain countries wherein they would only prefer the insurance coverage or taken within their own region, and moreover there is another point is that the insurance coverage of each and every country with respect to terms and condition differs. So that is why it is advisable to set on to or to agree on to the terms of contract incorporating this insurance parameter on a prior basis, so that later on there is no tussle between the seller and the buyer. So that means those clear line of demarcation are already been defined through the contract of sale, and the only thing that the buyer in this case has to consider is that at least a minimum basic cover will be provided by the seller, not beyond that is to be taken by the seller, and that too when it is decided on the prior basis. If it is not decided on the prior basis that the seller is going to undertake the insurance factor, then in that case the seller cannot be held responsible for the same, because X works is such condition wherein everything right from loading to unloading to paying the import taxes is there onto the shoulder of the importer, right. So that means it is very clear the onus lies to the buyer, the maximum onus lies to the buyer. So that is why it is called X works, which is excluding all the activities in the course of completing a transactions to wherein that ultimately reaches out to the destination point. So that means it is very simplistic for the seller and a little more heavier on the part of the buyer. Another commonly used terminology or Incoterm is your FCA. So wherein it talks about that in this case where the cost of your export packaging, right from starting that export packaging ka cost, then your loading charges, then your delivery to port, then your you could say any other custom duty charges, any your custom duty charges, like if there being anything with respect to conducting the transaction that lies onto the shoulder of the seller. Thereon when it proceeds to the terminal, so terminal onwards जो है cost and risk जो है it passes on to the buyer. Before that it is there onto the shoulder of your seller, and thereon the minute that those terminal charges are to be paid, it has to pass on the liability, the cost and the risk on the shoulder of your buyer. Again, those parameters with respect to export formalities, with respect to import formalities, that means which states that the case of your export formalities are to be taken up by your exporter and your import formalities are to be taken by your buyer, no matter what, whether what layer of activities falls onto the shoulder of your seller or what layers of activities fall onto the shoulder of your buyer. This is very clear that wherever the documents that are supposed to be provided by the exporter, he will cooperate in the same, since it's a matter of your international relations. So that ways it will make ensure that in this very case of free carrier alongside, when we are talking about that FCA, so in this very parameter, the buyer will be there responsible from paying the terminal charges. So right where when you are supposed to pay the terminal charges, there onwards to loading the product on the carriage, to paying those carriage charges, to paying for insurance, to the destination terminal charges, to unloading, import duties, destination terminal charges. So everything is to be borne by the buyer. So you would see as we proceed down the line, or as we move towards from X works to FCA, we see a change in the terms of the risk and the responsibilities that passes on to the seller. Now the seller is supposed to provide something more than just providing the packaging services. So the seller in this case, free carrier alongside, so in that case the seller is supposed to you could say export packaging के अलावा loading charges, your delivery charges, your export duties, he is supposed to pay those. So this FCA, which is free carrier, so which says that ki up to the point of your carrier, everything will fall onto the shoulder of your seller, and the minute that carrier is the goods are there onto the terminal, the minute you pay, the buyer will pay the terminal charges. So carrier onwards, everything is to be onto the shoulder of whom? The buyer. The buyer is supposed to pay the carrier charges, the terminal charges, the unloading charges, the loading charges even per se. So everything is there onto the shoulder of your buyer. So when we say free carrier, so in this case of your free carrier, again insurance is one such parameter which is very negotiable. That means with respect to the same, the seller and the buyer can come to that middling point, or they can decide on a prior basis that what set of cost or risk is to be borne by the seller, and to what extent the insurance coverage will be provided by the seller, and proceeding what if the buyer, let's suppose, want to top up the same. So in those cases the buyer is supposed to pay the additional charges for the same. So that ways it very specifically fixes out the responsibility. So that ways if you write in a contract of sale that it's a free carrier, in that case it is automatically resolved that okay, what part of responsibilities lies onto the seller and what part is there onto the shoulder of your buyer. So that ways it is very clear about the same. Again, as I mentioned about export and import formalities, irrespective of any Incoterms, it is supposed that all the documents that are to be provided by the seller, he is supposed and he is obligated to provide those documents and especially cooperate with the importer. And similarly, if any documentation being required on the part of importer with respect to import formalities, those formalities will be given, will be provided by whom? Will be provided by the importer. So that ways the document has to be very clearly, it has to be mention about all those details, the contract has to mention about all those details, wherein that it specifies the role of both the seller and the buyer, and it talks about that what set of obligation or the cost and risk is to be borne by the seller and what segment is to be taken by the buyer. So when we say that na in FCA, that is free carrier, so another parameter in this case is that ki mode of transportation kaun sa hoga. So mode of transportation again can be your rail, road, it can be airlines, it can be seaways, so it can be any mode of transportation. So herein with respect to this very Incoterm, there is no specific you could say set of your transportation that is to be considered while considering these Incoterms, where we say about okay, the seller in this case will do what, every activity till those terminal charges are paid off. The minute right after your terminal charges or sorry, the export duties tak, terminal charges are to be borne by your buyer. So export duties tak jo hai aapke charges, it will be borne by your buyer, and export duties के onward जितने आपके terminal charges हैं, loading charges हैं, carriage charges हैं, ये buyer pay करेगा, because the term say that, the term says कि ठीक है, the seller is only obligated to pay the packaging charges, the seller is only obligated कि सामान को उसके बाद loading जो भी charges होते हैं, तो the seller is supposed to pay those loading charges and then make sure कि load होने के बाद सामान, let's suppose किसी truck के through load हो रहा है पोर्ट तक जाने के लिए, तो सामान पैकेज होगा, उसके बाद ट्रक पर लोड होगा एंड देन जो है वो पोर्ट तक मूव ऑन करेगा एंड पोर्ट के जो आपकी एक्सपोर्ट ड्यूटीज़ हैं, यहाँ तक की जो लाइबिलिटी है वो सेलर की है, यहाँ तक का रिस्क, यहाँ तक का कॉस्ट जो है सेलर का है। अब इसके बाद जो फर्दर ऑन व्हेन वी टॉक अबाउट कि टर्मिनल चार्जेस देने हैं, गुड्स को वेसल पर लोड करना है, वेसल की कैरियर चार्जेस देने हैं, इंश्योरेंस फैक्टर है आपका, देन डेस्टिनेशन के टर्मिनल चार्जेस हैं जब गुड्स जो डेस्टिनेशन पे रीच आउट कर रहे हैं, देन उसके बाद डिलीवरी डेस्टिनेशन तक वहाँ पर जाकर अनलोड करना है, वहाँ की इंपोर्ट ड्यूटीज़ देनी है। सो वो सारा फैक्टर जो है ऑब्लिगेशंस और कॉस्ट जो है बायर के हेड पर होगा। सो दैट मीन्स वी वेरी कैटेगोरिकली fixate the responsibilities, the obligations of the seller and buyer with respect to how much is to be borne by the seller and what proportion is to be taken by the the buyer. So we talk about ki okay, the risk will transfer the very minute the terminal charges are to be borne. So जब terminal charges borne करने की बात आएगी तो buyer is the one who has to bear these terminal charges, and export import formalities again it remains the same, and second factor is insurance, again it is going to be very negotiable one, that okay, both of them, both the parties concile with respect to the same कि okay, what part is to be borne and कितना insurance coverage आपका provide करना है. So that ways these two are the very commonly used Incoterms and they are very basic in nature, which gives a very lesser burden of obligations or risk on to the seller, and thereon it passes on to the buyer. We will be talking about much more with respect to the various other Incoterms in the second segment. Thank you.